20,000 juvenile mussels bred in Maryland's hatcheries were released into a section of water so starved of oxygen that nearly every scientist expected total disaster. These fragile creatures, nature's filtration powerhouse, were sent straight into what many called an ecological suicide mission. Yet, as skepticism mounted and failure seemed inevitable, an unforeseen chain reaction began to unfold beneath the surface. What happened next would upend conventional wisdom and challenge everything experts thought they knew about restoring dying waters. How did a move this reckless become a spark for hope? For decades, the accepted wisdom in water restoration was simple and strict. Only release mussels where they are guaranteed to survive. Every protocol, every permit, every dollar spent demanded proof that the site could support these filter feeders. In Maryland's case, that meant extensive surveys, oxygen readings, and careful placement, never risking a mass die-off. The reason was clear. Native freshwater mussels had already vanished from huge stretches of river. 14 of 16 species in the region are now listed as rare, threatened, or endangered. Generations of pollution, dam construction, and silt smothered the riverbeds where mussels once anchored themselves by the millions. By the early 2020s, natural recolonization was nearly impossible. Hatcheries became the last hope, churning out juvenile mussels in numbers nobody had seen before. In 2025, Maryland's Joseph Manning Hatchery in Brandywine produced a record 75,000 mussels, a tenfold increase over the previous year. These tiny shellfish, each less than an inch long, spent their earliest days growing inside protective silos sunk into the riverbed, shielded from predators and silt. The method worked. In pilot projects on the Upper Potomac, survival rates soared. Out of 368 juveniles placed in silos, 358 survived the summer, an astonishing 97%. The science seemed settled. Stick to proven sites, protect the mussels, and scale up only when the data says it is safe. But not everyone was convinced. Local watermen, whose livelihoods depend on the health of the rivers, watched these experiments with a mix of hope and doubt. A veteran fisherman standing on the muddy banks shook his head at the idea of releasing thousands of hatchery mussels into water with little chance of survival. He called it throwing good money after bad, his voice rough from years on the water. We have seen what happens when you ignore the basics. You cannot just dump them in and expect a miracle. That skepticism ran deep. For years, restoration meant caution, never risking a mass release in places where oxygen levels dipped too low. The very idea of sending 20,000 juvenile mussels into water starved of oxygen seemed reckless, even absurd. Agencies had always avoided these so-called dead zones. Scientists warned that without enough oxygen, mussels would suffocate within days. The protocols were designed to prevent that kind of failure. Breaking from those standards was not just a bureaucratic risk, it was a gamble with the future of restoration itself. Yet the scale of the crisis forced a new kind of thinking. Rivers that once ran clear now struggled under the weight of sediment and nutrients. Traditional fixes like dredging or costly engineering could not keep up. Hatchery managers pointed to their success stories, but even they knew the numbers were a drop in the bucket compared to what was lost. Every year, the gap between what was possible and what was needed grew wider. Against this backdrop, the decision to attempt a large-scale release into an oxygen-depleted stretch of water was not just controversial. It broke every rule in the book, setting up a collision between old-school caution and a desperate need for results. Approval for the mass release did not come easily. At the center of the debate stood Dr. Paul Ashton, a biologist whose career had been shaped by the slow decline of Maryland's rivers. Ashton had spent years watching mussel populations dwindle, his notebooks filled with the names of vanished species and the numbers that told their story. He knew the rules inside out. Never release without proof. Never risk a die-off. But he also knew the limits of caution. The old playbook had protected what little remained, but it was not rebuilding what was lost. When the proposal landed on his desk, it read like an act of desperation. 20,000 juvenile mussels all at once into a stretch of water where oxygen levels hovered near zero. The application outlined every risk, every reason the plan could fail. Field staff warned of suffocation. Models predicted rapid mortality. The paperwork moved up through the Department of Natural Resources, gathering red ink and nervous signatures. Yet Ashton saw something else, a chance to test whether mussels could act as ecosystem engineers in the truest sense, not just surviving but transforming their environment. He argued that mussels, by filtering water and binding sediment, might create pockets of improved conditions even in places that seemed hopeless. The ecosystem engineer theory was well known, but no one had tried it at this scale or under such harsh circumstances. Ashton's belief was not blind faith. It was rooted in experiments that showed mussels could thrive when given even a small foothold. He pointed to the Potomac pilot, where protected juveniles had defied expectations and survived a punishing summer. If even a fraction of the 20,000 could hold on, the effects could ripple outward. Cleaner water, clearer channels, a first step toward recovery. As the decision moved toward final approval, the debate grew heated. Some colleagues called it ecological suicide. Others, worn down by years of incremental progress, were ready to try anything. The permit was signed in late spring, with a clause requiring constant monitoring and a promise that every outcome, good or bad, would be reported in full. Ashton gathered his team in the hatchery, surrounded by trays of tiny mussels barely visible to the naked eye. He explained the plan, the risks, and the hope that they might see something no one expected. The hatchery manager, Anna Della Penta, checked the inventory one last time. Every mussel would be tagged, every step logged. On the morning of the release, the team loaded the juveniles into insulated coolers, their shells clinking softly. They drove out to the river, passing stretches of water that had not seen a healthy mussel bed in a generation. The air was thick with uncertainty. Ashton watched as the first handful of mussels slipped beneath the surface, vanishing into the murky water. The experiment had begun, not with fanfare, but with a quiet gamble on the possibility of change. Within weeks of the release, the riverbed became a graveyard. Staff returned to the site with clipboards and waiters, counting shells that hadn't moved since the day they were placed. Out of the original 20,000 mussels, nearly 8,000 were gone, lifeless, gaping shells scattered across the silt. The number was impossible to ignore. 40% mortality, logged and confirmed, with no sign of predators or disease. The data sheets filled up with zeros and dashes. The oxygen meters still read near zero. For the team, the project's fate seemed sealed by the numbers alone. Dr. Ashton stood on the bank, boots sinking into mud, silent as the results came in. He had argued for the experiment, but now the evidence lined up against him. His colleagues began to distance themselves, some quietly, others with pointed emails. One memo from a senior aquatic ecologist landed in his inbox. This outcome was predictable. The protocols exist for a reason. We can't afford to lose more stock. The backlash spread beyond the lab. Critics in the agency called for an immediate halt to fieldwork, warning that further losses would set back restoration for years. Local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines questioned the wisdom of gambling so many hatchery-raised mussels on a stretch of river that had failed every test. Letters poured in from conservation groups, some sympathetic, most demanding accountability. The project's budget came under review. Funding for future releases was frozen pending investigation. Among the critics, Dr. Marcia Lynn, a senior biologist known for her rigorous skepticism, became the loudest voice. She had warned from the start that mussels could not survive in such hostile conditions. To her, the die-off was proof that the science had been ignored. At a public meeting, she laid out the numbers in stark terms. We lost 40% in the first month. That's not just a setback, that's a failure of leadership and a waste of resources. The sense of defeat was hard to shake. Ashton's team gathered in the hatchery, reviewing every step, searching for mistakes. The protocols had been followed, the monitoring was thorough, but the result was the same. Thousands of empty shells and a project on the brink. Some wondered aloud if the critics had been right all along. If the old rules existed for a reason, maybe this gamble had been doomed from the start. Yet the data, grim as it was, forced a new kind of scrutiny. The mortality rate was undeniable, but the pattern was not uniform. Not every site was a total loss. Some clusters of mussels survived, holding on in pockets where the silt was thinner or the current stronger. Ashton flagged these anomalies for deeper investigation. If there was any hope left, it would come from understanding why some mussels endured when so many others had not. A technician from the monitoring team crouched on the riverbank, boots half buried in silt, holding a handheld microelectrode barely thicker than a pencil lead. The morning was quiet, the water flat and dark, the air heavy with the memory of loss. Most of the sensor readings from the previous weeks matched what everyone expected. Dissolved oxygen levels stuck stubbornly near zero, especially around the empty shells where mussels had not survived. But then, in one of the scattered clusters where a few mussels still clung to life, the numbers began to shift. The probe, pressed gently into the sediment beside a living shell, registered 0.5 milligrams per liter. Then, a few centimeters closer to the mussel, the reading jumped, 1.2 milligrams per liter, then 2.8 milligrams per liter. At the very edge of the shell, the number climbed again, peaking at just over 4 milligrams per liter. The technician checked the calibration, ran the measurement twice more, and then radioed the data back to the main team. That afternoon, Dr. Ashton returned to the site. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb the silt. The technician handed over the logbook, pages marked with fresh ink and question marks. Ashton studied the numbers, tracing the spike from background levels to the sudden, localized surge. He leaned over the water, watching as a thin stream of filtered sediment drifted from the mussel's siphon. The readings made no sense, not in a stretch of river that should have been a biological desert. He asked for the probe and took the measurement himself. The result was the same, a pocket of oxygen, small but real, right at the shell's edge. Word of the discovery spread quietly among the team. Some dismissed it as a fluke, a technical error, or the result of an unnoticed current. But the technician ran controls upstream and downstream, away from the surviving mussels. Everywhere else, the levels stayed flat, lifeless. Only beside the clusters did the oxygen rise, forming invisible halos around the survivors. Ashton called in a second set of probes, cross-checked the calibration, and repeated the measurements over several days. Each time, the pattern held. The data log began to fill with small spikes, scattered across the map like pinpricks of hope. Ashton sat on the tailgate of the monitoring truck that evening, staring at the numbers. For years, he had argued that mussels could act as ecosystem engineers, but he had never seen direct evidence, no mechanism, just theory. Now, with a stack of sensor readings and a handful of survivors, the river was offering something unexpected. The possibility that these animals were not just enduring, but actively reshaping their microenvironment hovered at the edge of certainty. He closed the logbook and looked out over the water, silent in the fading light, wondering what else they might have missed. Sunlight began to reach deeper into the water. For the first time in years, the riverbed was visible beneath the surface. Stones, plants, and even the slow movement of crayfish. Water clarity, once choked by suspended sediment, climbed by 35%. The change was not subtle. Where the bottom had been a murky blur, now there were patches of clear green light. Submerged grasses started to reclaim territory, spreading across 12 acres that had been barren since the last major flood. Shoots of wild celery and pondweed took hold in the loosened silt, their roots anchoring the riverbank against erosion. Fish followed the plants. Monitoring nets set out in the shallows recorded a jump in numbers. Before the experiment, technicians counted an average of 6 fish per square meter, mostly small hardy species like shiners and sunfish. By midsummer, that number had quadrupled. 24 fish per square meter darted among the new grass beds, including perch, juvenile bass, and even a few young catfish, drawn by the shelter and food. Invertebrates returned as well. Mayfly nymphs, freshwater snails, and the occasional dragonfly larva appeared, all indicators of a recovering ecosystem. The mussels themselves, scattered across the riverbed, kept filtering. Each one pulled gallons of water through its gills every day, trapping algae and fine particles. The combined effect was visible from the bank: clearer water, lush vegetation, and the steady return of life to a stretch of river once written off as lost. The experiment had started as a gamble, but the numbers now told a different story. Recovery was possible, and it was happening in real time. Across research labs and policy offices, the results from Maryland's experiment drew immediate attention. Restoration teams in Pennsylvania and Virginia began running their own trials, adjusting protocols to test whether mussels could drive recovery in places once written off as too damaged or too expensive to fix. In Australia and Sweden, where river health faces similar threats, agencies reached out for data, hoping to replicate the approach in their own struggling watersheds. The numbers spoke for themselves. While traditional engineering solutions like dredging or aeration can run up to $30,000 per acre, the mussel-based method costs just $8,000 per acre, including hatchery operations, field monitoring, and follow-up surveys. For cash-strapped programs, that difference opened doors. Funding agencies took notice. The Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement, freshly updated in late 2025, set new targets for mussel restoration across 10 tributaries by 2040. Regional workshops shifted focus from small pilot plots to landscape-scale planning, with biologists sharing survival data and lessons learned. The concept of using living organisms as restoration tools, once seen as risky, gained traction not just for its ecological promise, but for its cost savings. Yet as the story spread, questions multiplied. How far could this approach go? Would it work in rivers with different chemistry, or in places where native mussels had vanished entirely? The research community found itself at the edge of a new paradigm, balancing hope with a clear-eyed need for more evidence. For now, the only certainty was that the Maryland experiment had changed the conversation, inspiring a global search for answers. Today, Maryland's mussel restoration pushes boundaries, but always within the limits of science, not myth. As climate change fuels more dead zones worldwide, Bold solutions face scrutiny and demand evidence. The challenge is not just what we dare to attempt, it is what we are willing to verify. In restoration, hope is powerful, but proof is essential. What risks would you take to revive a dying ecosystem? Share your thoughts below